Bob on passing the baton without losing a step. Have you guys appreciated Bob and the time he's poured into this? This is, if we only knew, if we only knew. I did hear they like that don't ask, don't tell policy. That's a good one. So, hey, tonight and this afternoon, we're going to have some free time for you guys to putz around. We've got a few options we'll toss past you later, but you're going to have some time this evening as well. The church is having an all-church meal. Am I getting this correct, Alan? Yes, so after church, you'll have an option, if you want to, of staying here and attending a class. You might be able to actually go back to your host family's house if you want to relax. I don't know whether they'll be here or not. Or there's also opportunities just to go out and hang out with one another. So we're giving you some free time today after we finish up today and right now. But thank you, Bob, for coming. And what's that? Oh, all right. Thank you, Bob, for coming, and thank you for sharing with us again.
Thank you, Phil. I mentioned to you that I am a morning person, but this time of afternoon is usually my nap time. I'm just going to tell you in advance. You may have heard this story. One Sunday evening, slept through a service I was supposed to be preaching. And I preached 3 times on Sunday morning. I had a funeral the next day, and I was supposed to preach that night, and I wasn't finished with my sermon. So I stayed in my office and finished my Sunday night sermon, then my funeral sermon. And church started at 7 o'clock. At 6:15, I was finished, and I was just exhausted. And I thought, I'm just going to lie down on the floor and rest for a minute. I laid down on the floor and said, I'm going to sleep. That's all right. I'll wake up. I'll hear the people coming in, or I'll hear the music, or my wife or somebody who cares will come in. Next thing I knew, I woke up and I thought this is Sunday. This is Sunday. I looked at my watch, said 7:35. Church started at 7 o'clock. I could hear the music in the background. I said, what am I going to do? I rushed into my restroom and washed my face and walked in confidently to the auditorium like I'd been counseling the mayor or something important. Well, the song leader, he was just dragging on the worship service, waiting for me to come in. And as soon as I walked in, he stopped, motioned for me. And I didn't know whether it was time to make announcements or time to preach. I didn't know what they had done. And I walked by him, and I meant to say, where are we in the service? And I said, where am I? He said, announcements. Well, I got up, and I looked, and you know how when you're fogged up like that? I couldn't remember one thing going on in church to announce all week long. And I looked out about 10 seconds. Finally, I said, folks, I got to be honest with you. I went to sleep in the office. I just woke up. Well, the place went bananas for about. Next morning, I came in, and there was a do not disturb sign on my office door. All my furniture was gone. There's a teddy bear on a cot, sucking his thumb. So if I go to sleep in the middle of, remember this old line about the preacher who dreamed that he was preaching and he woke up and he was? That could be me. This is an important subject of my last topic. I want to talk to you about passing the baton without missing a step. John Maxwell wrote, achievement comes to someone when he's able to do great things for himself. Success comes when he empowers his followers to do great things with him. Significance comes when he develops leaders to do great things for him, but a legacy is created only when a person puts his organization into the position to do great things without him. So I'm going to talk about passing the baton to your successor, putting the church in a position to do great things without you. Now, naturally, when you bring this subject up, our mind immediately goes to a person retiring, passing the baton on to the person who's going to take his place. And so this applies to everybody 55 and over. And that is going to be some of my experience that I talk about, that I relate to you. But I hope those of you who are younger will look at it more broadly than that and apply these principles to mentoring someone to immediately step in for you should something or unforeseen happen. If you get hit by a bus. Or more importantly, you're mentoring someone to do what you're doing someplace else. They're learning from you all along. And David Novak, who is the CEO of Yum, the largest restaurant chain in the world, said, true leaders don't create followers. True leaders create leaders. Now, I think there are 3 reasons that every church should consider a transition plan. The first is the biblical precedent. Moses had Joshua with him for 40 years, and then Joshua took over. Elijah passed the mantle on to Elisha. Paul chose Timothy to be his understudy. Barnabas took John Mark under his wing. Each successor was trained by the mentor who gave them on-the-job training, first-hand experience. Then the mentor stepped aside or was taken out of the way, and the transition occurred. 2 Timothy 2:2, Paul says, "The things you have heard me say in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to reliable men who will be able to teach others also." So part of our job as a preacher, a leader, even in a church that's just starting, new church plant, we want to bring younger people alongside who will be able to do this same thing in another location or take our place should we be gone. The second reason for a transition plan is the example in the business world. In recent years, major corporations are giving considerable attention to their successor of the CEO because they've seen so many times a business does well, then the CEO dies or retires, and they bottom out. Jim Collins in Built to Last, in his book, he has an entire section on mentoring, and he writes, "Do not fall into the trap of thinking the only way to bring about change and progress at the top is to bring in outsiders who might dilute or destroy the core. The key is to develop and promote insiders who are highly capable of stimulating healthy change and progress while preserving the core." Jesus said the children of darkness are often wiser than the children of light, but we ought to learn from the business world. So many times in the church, we don't even think about who's the next guy. And something happened, the preacher gets sick, or the youth minister's gone, and we say, who's going to take his place? And it's just a random choice, sometimes good, sometimes bad. Third reason for a transition plan is simply common sense. Let's say you had a wealthy businessman come to you and say, "I need somebody to transport my 2 children from New York City to Los Angeles. And you know it's going to take you 2.5, 3 days to drive it. They can't fly. I'll give you $100,000 if you'll drive my 2 kids." You jump at the chance. But you also look in advance, your common sense would say, you know what, I don't think I can stay awake for 3 days. I'm going to get somebody to go along with me who can drive part-time. I'm going to give them $25 an hour, or whatever you're going to give, so that when you get tired, you can turn it over to somebody else. And if you look to the future and you really love the kingdom of God and you love people, you got to look down the road and say, there's going to come a time when I'm ineffective. I can't keep doing this forever. I'm going to die someday. What's going to happen when I'm gone? And just as we buy life insurance to protect our families should something unforeseen happen, we need to make provisions for a church family to continue after we are taken out of the way. Now, there is a temptation to say, well, God is sovereign. He'll make the choice. We're just going to trust him. And we point to some church that the preacher was killed in an accident, and they went out and they got somebody, and it went great. Well, you can use the same logic to talk about an accident where somebody didn't wear a seatbelt, and they were thrown out and they were spared. But the odds are in your favor if you have a planned transition plan. Well, I'll tell you what motivated me to think about this back in the late 1990s. Our church did a strategic plan. We got surveys from the congregation, and one of the things on the surveys is what's going to happen when Bob Russell retires. Or we build a building, and we had to borrow $26 million. And the bank said, well, we will loan you the money, but you have to have a key man life insurance policy worth half of the loan. So I had a life insurance policy on me for $13 million. And I was afraid to go across the street. Some elder comes and say, I think we're going to make a sacrifice, or my wife make a sacrifice for Jesus. And there's something wrong about that. So we began to think, are we building a cult here, or are we really preparing for the future? But the one thing that motivated it all, I read a book by Joel Gregory called Too Great a Temptation. Joel Gregory was selected by W.A. Criswell to be his successor at First Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas. At that point, First Baptist Church was the flagship church for the Southern Baptists. And Criswell was nearing 80 years old, and so he selected Joe Gregory, a great orator, to be his successor. Gregory resigned his church, came on campus with First Baptist, but they didn't have a definite transition plan, and Criswell would not let go of the baton, and Gregory was pulling at it. The two got at odds, and it nearly split that church. Both of them made bad decisions. And so Gregory wrote a book about it called Too Great a Temptation, that power, even power in the church, can go to a person's head, and they have a hard time releasing it. I was sobered by that book, and I thought to myself, this cannot happen at Southeast Christian Church in Louisville, Kentucky. At that time, we probably were the flagship church for our movement. And I said, we got to be smarter than that. God's doing some great things. If we're going to be a wonderful church, a healthy church for 100 years, we've got to think about the next phase. So I asked our elders, would you read this book? They were sobered by it, and they said to me, when you go on your study break next summer, would you come back with a skeleton transition plan that we can begin to tweak so we can plan what we're going to do in the next decade or next 15 years about transition? That was the genesis of our transition. Now, I came back. By the way, we got listed here the transition in a track meet. Here are essentials for passing the baton. The runner passing the baton must keep going full step until the transition. You don't quit before you transition. The person receiving the baton must begin running prior to the arrival of the one approaching. There's got to be a coordination. We're running full steam together. And the two must stay in the same lane. If you don't have the same philosophy, you don't have the same doctrine, it's not going to work. Then there must be a timely release and reception. There's a line on the track that says this is when the transition has to occur. And if the transition is smooth, there should be a step gained in the race because the one is reaching forward to give, the other is reaching back, so it's possible to gain a step. Rick Pitino coached the University of Kentucky to a national championship. He passed the baton on to Tubby Smith. The next year, Tubby Smith won the national championship. That is a great transition. And the one passing the baton must get out of the way and root for the one running. The one who passed the baton runs across the center of the infield. He doesn't run alongside the next person coaching him. He goes around and he cheers for them. So those were some of the reasons we thought of a transition plan. So I came back from a summer break. I had 5. They asked me to do a skeletal plan. I had 5 steps in my plan. Number 1, Dave Stone would be my successor. Dave Stone had been on staff for 10 years. He was doing most of the preaching when I was not in the pulpit. Congregation loved him. He was a good leader. He was capable, and it was kind of naturally assumed that he would be my successor. Number 2, I would retire sometime before the year 2008. I was introducing this plan now in 1999, and we looked 7, 8 years down the road, and I said, I will step out before 2008. I eventually moved it back to 2006. The third step was a younger third preaching minister would be added to the staff so that there'd be someone to share the preaching load with Dave when I was gone. Dave and I Dave been preaching about once a month. I've been preaching the other 3 times, and we'd been sharing the pulpit. It was going really well with the congregation. But Dave Stone was more of a topical preacher. Elders felt like we also needed to have somebody on staff who was more of an expository Bible teacher. So we spent 2 or 3 years looking for a third person. We eventually arrived at Kyle Eidemann, who was 26 when he came on staff. Fourthly, in my plan, I would not take another church, but I would not return to Southeast worship services for an entire year. I was 62 and a half when I retired, but I decided I would not come back to worship or be a part of the church for an entire year so that it would signal to the congregation I was gone, and they wouldn't be, my successor wouldn't have to look over his shoulder as to how I was receiving his innovative ideas, and he wouldn't be second guessed all the time. And then finally, the financial agreement between the church and me would be left up to the discretion of the elders. I did not come back and say, okay, in my transition plan, here's the financial package I will accept if you give it to me. I just said it's up to you guys. And I got to tell you, they were more than generous to me. I'd been there 40 years, and many of them were businessmen who knew what it was like when you step aside in the business world and you're given a golden parachute. And I don't know of anybody who had I'll tell you what they did. They said, we are going to see to it, we're going to evaluate what you got, 401k plan, Social Security, we're going to have an actuary do this, and we're going to make up the difference of what you will have when you retire that you've got saved up and what your last year's salary will be, and we will pay you as long as you live, that's the amount that you will have every year. Then they said, if you die, we'll give the same to your wife. They didn't know I was going to live to be 80. I hope I live to be 100. That'll get them. But the church ought to be a model employer. And that's how good they were to me. I don't tell everybody that, but this is not on YouTube or anything. And the transition went well. We announced it to the church. I wouldn't recommend this. We announced it to the church 5 years in advance. We said, here's what we're going to do. Next 5 years, Dave Stone's going to be preaching more. I'm going to be preaching less. I'm going to pass the baton on to him. And, people will accept something 5 years down the road, and some of them didn't like it. Some of them rejoiced over it. But slowly, and then it got down to 6 months, and I was going to be out. In January, I said to the elders, look, I'm becoming a lame duck. I think what we need to do, let's announce, I'll preach the times that I'm supposed to preach between now and June, next 6 months. But let's just make Dave Stone the senior minister right now. And take away maybe, and I announce the congregation. From this point on, Dave Stone is the senior minister. I'm going to preach, but if you've got any gripes and complaints, take them to Dave Stone. Don't bring them to me. I don't want to hear them anymore. And it was a wonderful period for me. The church, we were running about 18,500 or so when I left, and they've gone on. They've had 14 satellites. Now they're averaging like 35,000 people. They're debt-free. Missions giving is like 25%. They have almost 2,000 baptisms a year. They really miss me. But it's been good for me. I made a list of things that I wanted to do when I retired. And I do these mentoring groups for preachers, and I do some Bible study for small groups. I write a blog every week. I travel and speak. And I told people, there was that saying about the best time of your life was when the kids are grown and the bills are paid and the dog's dead. That's been the best period for me. For the last 18 years, I've done that. And if you're going to think about retiring, we're going to expand and talk about mentoring in a second. But if you're thinking about retiring, you need to retire to something, not just from something. You need to have a carrot out there. And I want to finish strong, but you only have so much energy. You can only do the same thing for so long. And eventually you need to have something fresh. I did 5 major fundraisers. I thought that's my last fundraiser. Then they started talking about satellite churches, and I didn't have the energy for it. And I'm 62 years old, and then we had 2 guys on staff, in Dave Stone and Kyle Ottoman. They're eager to do it, and it was time for me to step aside. 62, that's pretty young for most. But I wanted to have another chapter in my life where I could make a contribution in a different way. I was honored to read that Rick Warren at the Saddleback Community Church in California said that the transition at Southeast was the best he'd ever seen. Now, there's some things I do differently, but I want to talk to you about strategy. By the way, before I get into that, the preacher, in my opinion, the preacher has to initiate this transition plan. It can't be initiated by the elders. I've consulted with several churches about this. I've had some elders come and say, would you consult with us about a transition plan? And then I consulted with them a little bit, and I find out it is not a transition plan, it's their termination plan. And it's not, the preacher isn't for it. He's kind of going along with it, but he's not for it. And all he's got to do is blink a little bit, and he's going to have a mutiny in the church. It needs to be initiated by the preacher and admit If it's a termination, admit that. But if it's a transition, it should become from the preacher. Number one, choose your successor wisely. This is pretty obvious, but I think we need to review it. Our plan worked so well because Dave Stone is such a quality person. Now, Dave and I are very different. I'm not out to clone me. He is an extrovert. I'm a little bit more of an introvert. He was younger. I'm older. He's more an evangelist. I'm a teacher. But the one thing, you have to have a common set of convictions. In that track meet, you got to be in the same lane. I can tell you, there's a Jim Toon, preached at the largest Christian church in Canada. And he became friends with a pastor in the area who was not from the Restoration movement. But they had a lot in common. They talked about church. He liked this guy. And finally he said, you're younger than I. I've got to transition out. I'm going to give more attention to my organization to plant churches in Canada. Will you be willing to take? Yeah, I'll take over for you. The elders took Jim's recommendation, but he didn't have the same convictions about the Restoration movement. And it wasn't very long before Jim began to hear him preaching some Calvinistic ideas and some semi-charismatic ideas and making the people in the congregation restless, and that congregation almost totally dissolved. Good guy, he'd been effective in another, but they weren't on the same page doctrinally. And the Bible talks about 1 Timothy 4:6, watch your life and your doctrine closely. Persevere in them, because if you do, you'll save both yourself and your hearers. Do not, listen to me, do not assume that because somebody came from the same Bible college that you did or the same background that they have the same beliefs you did. Because our schools are changing and people come out with different ideas. And there needs to be an honest conversation. What do you believe about these basics of the Bible? What do you believe about the restoration plea? So choose your successor wisely. Obviously, he should be a man of character. Let me tell you, as a leader, every time I found somebody who was really gifted, but they were a little shaky in character, but I said, boy, they're so gifted musically, let's go ahead and hire them. It came back to bite me every time. Character matters more than talent. He should be loyal to you. Dave Stone was my designated successor for 5 years. I do not recommend that. We got along, but that's a tough time. 2 years would be the longest that I would recommend. But we made it work because he was loyal to me. He would praise me in public. He stood up for me behind my back. He would say, well, Bob's the quarterback. It's his call. I'm the second man. He should also be a patient person. If the successor is too eager beforehand and jumps the gun and seems too anxious, it creates tension in the congregation. Also, after he takes over, if he's too quick to introduce changes when he becomes the senior minister, he creates unrest. Fred Craddock said, you don't rearrange the furniture in the room of a disoriented person. When there's a transition that takes place, especially if a guy's been there a while, the congregation is disoriented. And they don't need a whole lot of dramatic changes. The change of minister is a big enough change for a year. Settle down, be patient. I said to a young guy who was taking over, look, don't make any changes fast. Oh, he said, I'm not gonna make any changes for 3 months, he said. Well, it's got to be longer than that. Just settle down. Then you've got a lot of good ideas, but be patient. Let the congregation adjust to you and gain credibility. The successor also should be very talented, should be more talented than you, because you want the successor to take the church to a higher level and beyond. Now, he's not going to have your experience. He's not going to have your relationships or wisdom with people, but he should have the potential to lead and preach better than you. Because if there is a significant decline in the quality of preaching in particular, the congregation will be unsettled and easily agitated. And Dave Stone, extremely talented, gifted guy. Charles Swindoll said, when a man of God dies, nothing of God dies. And that's what you want to achieve, saying, hey, this church isn't about the preacher, it's about Jesus Christ. And we're just making a transition to exalt Christ. Number 2. Mentor, but don't micromanage. Initially, I heard about mentoring, and I had a misconception about what it means to mentor somebody, and I was reluctant to do it because it seemed so time-consuming. I would hear guys say, You find, like Paul had Timothy, you find somebody in your church who is an understudy, and you pour your life into that person. That used to be what you hear that expression. You just pour your life into that person. Well, I pictured you find somebody, and then you formally get together once a week for a 45-minute period, and you teach them, and you pour your life in. And I tried that, and after about half hour of pouring my life into them, I didn't have anything left to pour. It was over. I thought, this is awkward. And I discovered that mentoring is sharing life experiences. Wisdom is more caught than taught. It's observing how leaders react to various situations. It's exposure. If I asked you who mentored you, who influenced you the most in the Christian life, you named a person, I'd say, give me 5 things that he told you. You couldn't come up with 5 things. It's just who they were, just being exposed. So I would say to younger guys on staff or to volunteer in the church, would you ride with me to this funeral? Would you drive me to this speaking engagement? How about us having lunch together? Attend this meeting with me. Read over this sermon. Tell me what you think. And I try not to lord it over them or have a condescending attitude. I rarely criticize or correct. If I treat an understudy with respect and regard them as an equal, and they like me, they love me, they're going to be motivated more than if I'm cramming something down their throat. I try to be more of a big brother and not a protective parent or dogmatic teacher. I told you about Kyle Eidelman becoming our third man. I told you last night about how he came to me and said, I don't want to wear a suit and tie anymore. So I said to him, okay, you don't have to wear a suit and tie. There's a caveat to that. I said, this doesn't seem like a big change, but it's going to symbolically be a big change to the people in the congregation. They come in, we're not wearing suits, and there's going to be a lot of talk about it. So before we make this change, let's take it to the elders. Let's let the elders, and I knew the elders would be reluctant, but they would eventually go along with it. So Dave Stone, my successor, went with me to an elders meeting, and I said, guys, I've had a talk with Kyle Eidelman. He'd like to be able to preach without suit and tie. Dave Stone the same way. Do you think that's okay? Now I'm going to tell you, we could spend $10 million in 20 minutes. They talked and they talked and they talked for an hour about whether it was disrespectful not to wear a tie in the pulpit. Couldn't get over it. Now, if you were to parachute into an elders meeting at Southeast Christian Church, I think you would be shocked at how little I talked week by week. Authority to me is like money in the bank. The less you say, the more you've got. Sometimes the people who talk the most in a meeting have the least influence. So when something came up in a board meeting, I would ask myself, is this critical or is it not critical? Oh, if it's not critical, I'm not going to say anything. Let the chairman handle it. And I want these guys to have the feeling they're overseeing the church. It's not something I'm cramming down. So I wouldn't say anything. And then if it was critical, I'd watch to see which way it was going. And if it was going the way I wanted it to go, I didn't say anything because I'm going to get my way anyway. If it was going the wrong way, that's when I would speak up. And that's when I had influence. So I was watching this night about they're talking about, well, people are going to say we don't have a coat and tie. You go to visit the President of the United States, you wear a coat and tie, and it's going to be disrespectful. And I knew who was talking and who had influence, and I knew which way. So I didn't say anything. And eventually, after almost an hour, they said, okay. Well, they reluctantly approved it. Walking out with Dave Stone, we were walking to the car, and he said, that was genius. He said, I watched you, and you didn't say anything. You didn't make anybody mad, and we walked away. If that had been me, I'd have blown my stack, and you just sat there and were quiet. And he said, I learned a lot from watching you tonight. Now, I don't think it was genius, but it was experience. And he wouldn't have learned that if I sat him in my office and said, I'm going to pour my life into you. He needed to see that in an elders meeting. And to me, that's mentoring. Now, I have to accept that my successor, after I'm gone, he's going to do some things differently than I. In worship, Dave Stone's more concerned about energy. I'm more concerned about reverence. In preaching, he's more concerned about producing emotion, laughter, tears, excitement. I want to produce teaching and learning like Jesus. Gosh. Is this on tape? But again, I'm not seeking to clone me, and when they do things differently, I've got to say, this is not a principle, this is a method. And that means I mentor, but don't micromanage. Number 3, successful transitions require an ongoing sacrifice of ego. Now, if you are sleepy right now, wake up. I don't know that I'm going to talk to you anything that's more practical than what I'm about to say. We all have egos. We all like to be needed. We like to be center stage. We like to hear compliments. That is human nature. Listen, if there is no fear, there's no such thing as courage. Just foolhardy. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is action in spite of fear. Now, if you have no ego, there's no such thing as humility. You're just insecure. But if you have an ego, humility is willingness to sacrifice your ego for the greater good. It's saying with John the Baptist, he must increase, I must decrease. And when you get serious about mentoring, it is going to require an ongoing sacrifice of ego. It is not a one-time event because you are preparing somebody to fill your shoes. And it is a process constantly taking place. I can remember the first time my secretary came to me and said, Bob, could you do a funeral Friday? I said, I really can't. I've got an appointment I've got to keep. Would you ask Dave Stone if he would do it? She said, well, actually, Dave Stone was their first choice, and he can't do it, and wondered if you could. Yeah, you can giggle at that if you want to, but if you're the senior pastor, that goes down hard. That's just, I was, one Wednesday night, we had Wednesday night services, and I was standing, and a woman I'd never met, Dave Stone and I were standing there talking. She goes, oh, it's good to see the two of you get along so well. I'm back here because my son, who's 16 years old, is getting baptized tonight. Dave, he loves your preaching. He thinks you're the funniest thing. He just loves, Dave, would you come meet my son? And she takes him away. And there I stood like a bump on a log or something, you know. And Dave later asked me if that bothered me. I said, no, it didn't bother me. I used to preach on a sophomore level too. So... The elders, as they got near and near to transition, they said, you know, there's a big gap between Dave's salary and Bob's salary, so we need to step up Dave's salary so that when Bob retires, he gets equal salary to what Bob's getting. And so the next 3 years, Dave Stone got 10% increase. I get a 3% increase. I'm telling you, if you're going to do it, you got to say, why am I here? Am I here to advance Bob Russell, or am I here to exalt Jesus Christ? Okay. I got time. I'll tell you. I told you about how Kyle Idleman came in and he preached with no notes. I mean, he didn't ramble. He just got up and preached with no notes, and it had depth to us. And people would stop me in the hallway and say, how long have you been preaching? You still use notes when you preach? That kid comes in here preaching with no notes. Man, I got sick of hearing it. And so finally, Denny Crum, who used to coach University of Louisville basketball team, was in a part of our church, and he said, hey, Bob, I'm going up to Indianapolis to the John Wooden Classic this weekend, and I know you've always wanted to meet Coach Wooden. Why don't you go with me? I said, okay, well, I'm not preaching this weekend. Kyle's preaching. So I think to myself, well, at least I won't have to hear on Saturday night people bragging about him preaching with no notes. So I went to Kyle's office, and I said, Kyle, I'm not going to be here on Saturday night when you preach. I'm going to go to Indianapolis. I get to meet Coach Wooden with Coach Crum. He said, well, that's great. You tell Coach Wooden I said hi. I said, so you know Coach Wooden? He said, yeah, when I was associate out there with Dudley Rutherford in California, Coach Wooden used to come to our church. I go to Indianapolis. I meet Coach Wooden. We have a great conversation. Then I remembered. I said, Coach Wooden, a guy named Kyle Idleman said to tell you hello. And Coach John Wooden said, Kyle Idleman, you know, he's the only preacher we ever had, didn't use any notes when he preached. I couldn't get away from him in Indianapolis. Now, if you're human, there's going to be a twinge of jealousy sometimes. And I know some preachers who, when they retire, actually hope things decline. They think that's a tribute to them. But you got to say, Christ comes first. And one of the best things people would say to me after I retired Bob, we really miss you, but you know, Dave and Kyle are doing a good job. That's what you want. Okay, number 4, establish a realistic timetable and stick to it. In the book, Too Great a Temptation, Joel Gregory pointed out, Criswell had him come on staff, but they had no line on the asphalt. This is when I step aside. This is when you take over. And it just kept dragging out and dragging out. And I thought, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to set a date. Unless God intervenes with a dramatic, undeniable red light, I'm going to stick to it. And listen, people are going to say to you, you'll know when it's time. Listen, by the time you conclude it's time, it's too late. Or you can delude yourself and you say, I've got close friends, they'll tell me when it's time. By the time your friends tell you, you've already lost it. Jack Ballard was the preacher of the Mount Carmel Christian Church in Atlanta, Georgia. He said, I preached in Atlanta, Georgia for 44 years. It should have been 40. And I thought about that. I don't want to go out like Bobby Bowden or Joe Paterno coaches. I want to go out like Dean Smith or Roy Williams. They go out on top. I want to go out without looking over my shoulder wondering whether people want me out. And so I established a date. The last Sunday in June 2006 was my last date, and I stuck to it. Now, that eliminates speculation. It allows the mentor to keep momentum going rather than trying to reverse a downward trend. It avoids congregational division, hurt feelings, and it requires a decisive spirit and a holy obstinance. I had 3 very influential guys in the church and in the community, not elders, 3 guys influential though, who asked me to go on a brief golf trip when I announced my transition plan. And the first night after we played golf, around the table they said, well, Bob, we're going to be real honest with you. This is not a golf trip. We're all 3 here to tell you we don't like your transition plan. We think you're leaving too early. We don't think Dave Stone's the man, and we want you to reconsider. What do you think that did for my ego right then? Boosted my ego. They want me to stay. All I had to do was blink. All I had to do was say, well, I'll go back and talk to the elders again. I'll pass on your concerns. And we stymied the plan. And I looked at him and I said, look, we've prayed about this. We've worked on it for over a year. The decision has been made. We're sticking to it. Let's play golf. End of discussion. And I think you've got to have a plan. And by the time you walk out of that plan, then you stick to it. 2 more. One is make a clean break and get out. I have seen too many retired preachers hanging on, hindering the work they gave their lives to establish. This is especially true of long ministries. If you stay on and you're doing the weddings and second-guessing the preacher and you get your feelings hurt and you listen sympathetically to criticism, you make life difficult for your successor. He won't admit it, but it's true. People would go to Dave Stone and say, Dave, don't you think Bob could stay on in the church? He doesn't have to be gone for a year. And at first Dave would say, well, I really think it's best that he be gone. He didn't want me there looking over his shoulder. I said, Dave, don't tell people that. You tell people Bob can do whatever. If he wants to stay, that's fine. Because I'm not staying. You don't have to cover for me. That way it doesn't make you look the bad guy. Now, there are exceptions to this. I've backtracked on this. I wrote a book about transition plan, but I've backtracked on this a little bit. I have seen churches where the preacher stays, father and son, or the preacher is really gifted at pastoral work, and the new guy coming in is a great pulpiteer, and the pastor stays on, and he really wants him to stay on, and he covers for him. He does all the counseling and the hospital visitation that frees up the preacher. There are exceptions, but it has to come from the successor, and it has to be a constant communication. Now, the transition was more difficult for my wife than me. My wife was on staff at church by this time. She was overseeing our bookstore, and she loved the administration of the bookstore. And she was not happy about me stepping aside when I did, and I wish I had been more open and communicate with her, and I wish she would have understood how many opportunities would open up for her, but eventually she bought into it. But if I could do something differently, I would communicate better with her. But to stay away a year was for me, it wasn't for my wife. I traveled and speak, and she would go back. But it was best for me. Let me give you an example. I'd been away a long time, hardly ever gone back, and I went back for a Christmas Eve program. And the Christmas Eve program was outstanding. Music was great. They'd been in a series on the colors of Christmas, and Christmas Eve was White Christmas. And Kyle preaches this great sermon on the blood of Christ will wash us whiter than snow. And at the end, they even sang a hymn, Wash Me and I Shall Be Whiter Than Snow. And while they're singing this hymn, it starts to snow in there. And I'm sitting there, and I'm thinking, my stars, who's going to clean up all this confetti after? Then a crystal hit my arm. I said, that's not confetti. They've got a snow machine in here. I wonder how much that snow machine's costing me. If I had been in a meeting and somebody brought up the idea of a snow machine on Christmas Eve, would I have approved it? I probably would have approved it, but I would have said, now next year we're not going to have any special effects because we don't want to get in a competition with more spectacular special effects every year, but I probably would have approved it. Around me, everybody saying, oh, Lord, thank you. You washed me whiter than snow. It's so beautiful. And I'm thinking, how much that thing cost? What am I going to do that? You know? Because I was so accustomed to what's going on behind the scenes, it's hard to get out of that mode. If I'd have been at Okolona Christian Church across town, had a white, I'd have said, oh, Lord, thank you. You washed me whiter than snow. But in my own environment, it's hard to go back. And I could worship better for a period somewhere else. So I think that's wise to make a clean break and get out. And the final thing is, enlist congregational commitment. Communicate to people what you're going to do and why. A house divided against itself cannot stand. Don't think that you're going to sneak up on people. Listen, the people in the church have got their antenna up and they're observing and they're speculating long before you bring it up. Respect their intelligence, honor their membership by giving them insider information. It's happened one or two times, and I learned the hard way. People in the church resent hearing about what's going on in their church from the media. They want to hear it from the point person. They want to hear it in advance. They want to feel like they've got insider information. So we announced our plan 5 years out, and then we'd periodically bring it up. And one of the things we did the 6 months before I retired, we had a series of sermons on what it means to be a member of Southeast Christian Church. We talked about 5 things that are expected of you to be a member. And we said, as of January 1st, 2006, 6 months before I retired, as of January 1st, 2006, no one is a member. We're going to ask for a congregational re-enlistment. And we're going to completely clean out our books, because we got duplications, we got people who have died, we've got people who have moved their membership, we have names on the list, we don't know who they are. We're going to clean up our books. Even if you're a charter member, nobody's a member as of January 1st. But you've got, here's the way you can be a member. You got 2-month period to fill out these forms. If you don't care enough about this church to take 15 minutes to fill out a form, you shouldn't be considered a member. We're going to have a congregational re-enlistment. Here's what it means to be a member. We go over this series. You would think you'd get a lot of flack from that. We got almost zero flack because everybody understood the need to do it, and they understood we're 6 months from Bob Russell's retirement, and we're saying, hey, we're committed to the Lord and the church. We're not committed to an individual. Interesting thing, our membership list went from 26,000 to 17,500. Our church attendance went up about 300 a week. And we had, like, during that period, 300 baptism or something. As we just talked about the basics, people responded. But we cleaned up our books, and it was much more helpful for the future. But before congregational commitment comes church board commitment. Let me backtrack just a little bit. I introduced the plan to the elders 5 or 6 years in advance. Now, they didn't immediately approve it. They said, we need some time to think this over. A few of our elders were uncertain. Some wanted to go on a nationwide search. Are we sure Dave Stone's the best preacher we can get? And so we weren't all on the same page initially, and we operate by consensus. We don't think the Holy Spirit's going to be divided. So they prayed, they discussed, and finally they were unified. And they came out of a meeting and said, okay, it's unanimous. Dave Stone is our successor, and we're not going to look back, and we're all going to stand behind him. An elderly woman who's a boss lady, like we were talking about, approached our chairman, almost pointing her finger in his chest in the atrium of our church. She said, I want to know what you're going to do when the man who built and established this church is gone. And as chairman of the elders, Matt Shelfon, said, ma'am, the man who started and built this church died on a cross 2,000 years ago and rose from the dead. I think we're going to be just fine. And went on and did what? Because the elder, again, if you got unity at the core, people don't blink, you can go through a lot. Jesus prayed, may there be one Father, as I am in you, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. Let me tell you about, in closing, the first elders meeting after I left. Elders got together, Dave Stone, Kyle Ideman, and the chairman said, we're not having the elders meeting tonight. We're going down to the sanctuary. They go down to the sanctuary, got a big old platform, one lone chair on this end, one lone chair on the other end. And they said, Dave and Kyle, this is where you're going to be preaching to people, and we want to spend the night just praying for you that God will anoint you as you preach, and God will honor your leadership. Dave, you sit in this chair. Kyle, you sit in this chair. And one by one, the elders would come up behind, put their hand on his shoulders, and pray for God's blessing. Unbeknownst to Dave and Kyle, the elders had also tapped into some of their best friends in church, and all of a sudden they got a hand on their shoulder, and they'd hear one of their best friends from church praying for them. Unbeknownst to Dave and Kyle, they brought in their family. And all of a sudden, they have his hand on his shoulder. They hear their mother praying for them. Didn't know she was there. Their dad praying for them. And they said the Holy Spirit came down. There wasn't a dry in the place. And that's why God blesses a transition. Achievement comes to someone when he's able to do great things for himself. Success comes when he empowers his followers to do great things with him. Significance comes when he develops leaders to do great things for him. But a legacy is created only when a person puts his organization in the position to do great things without him. The things that you've heard me say in the presence of many witnesses, you entrust to reliable men who will be able to teach others also. Okay, thank you. Let's pause for questions. Any questions?
When did you know David Stone was the guy? You said he was with you for 10 years, but when along that,
I can't point to a definite figure. When he came on staff and he started preaching and the congregation responded so well to him more and more, and he started growing, he was head and shoulders above, in that role, others on staff. Now, I got to admit, when I finally announced Dave Stone is going to be my successor, a couple other guys on staff were disappointed. But it was a process more than it was a single event. It was just seeing, and I would say probably a year or two before I designated he was my successor, I felt it. W. Deming has a saying, the most important facts are unknown and unknowable. You ask me, how much is that building going to cost? Well, they say $10 million. How many people are going to be won to Christ because of that building? I don't have a clue. But in my gut, I feel it. And there are times you just got to go when you feel like they're nudging of the Holy Spirit.
So in a large church where you've got staff on there, like you're able to identify a successor like that, what would you say again to people who, like the elders are going to have to hire somebody for a successor or whatever, like what's that process? How's that different than like...
Are you saying if you don't have somebody on staff who is going to be your successor?
Yeah,
I would be very hesitant to say, we're hiring you to be my successor. I would find a niche for them on the staff. Say, would you come in and fill in for me once a month or once every 6 weeks as a preacher? Would you oversee our college program or something? Let them give them an opportunity to see how they blend in with the DNA of your church. But to say to a guy, you're my successor, and then he comes on, and pretty soon you see it's not working, then you got to get rid of them or disappoint them by telling them, I've changed my mind.
So in order to that successor, you need to see him in action. So talk about how you mentored Dave. How did you know that Dave would even be one to preach in your church? Did you hire him to do some of the preaching, or did you?
Yeah, when we hired him as a college minister. But I also knew he was a good communicator, and I decided that I would ask him to preach 5 or 6 times a year in my absence. And then I saw how that was responding, and then I'd give him one more weekend a year. And we kind of gradually moved into that.
Did you know Kyle would take over after Dave Stone?
No, that would be up to Dave Stone. The congregation assumed that would be the case, that he would be the successor, but they didn't announce that until 2 or 3 years before Kyle took over. Dave actually stayed only 13 years, I think, something like that, and kind of surprised people by moving out sooner than they anticipated that he would. But Kyle was ready. Kyle does not have a successor. And I kind of wish he would. He's very young. He's in his 40s. But he still would be healthier if the congregation knew if Kyle up and leaves, here's going to be. But now we've got a guy on staff who's starting to fill in, who is outstanding, and people are whispering and say, I'll bet if Kyle leaves, it'll be Carl Cool who takes over. It's kind of bubbled up. Is Dave still at Southeast Church? No, Dave kind of, he fills in at 3 or 4 different large churches and 4 or 5 times a year for several different churches. He travels and speaks. He sometimes, if he's in town, he goes to one of the satellite churches. Okay, I'm on board a plane here in a few minutes. I'm going to leave. I'm going to ask you, I have a wonderful wife. She has, for the last 5 weeks, experienced vertigo. And it's just really, really struggling, making her nauseous, uncertain. And I've spent the last 5 or 6 weeks driving Miss Judy to every place that she needs to go. And if you'd remember her in prayer, in addition to the prayer for the new baby, I'd very much appreciate that she would recover. I've been surprised how many people have experienced that, and it's not a pleasant experience. But thanks, Phil.